Hi, I'm Elle, and welcome to episode 2 of our Universal Upgrades series, where we have conversations in the pursuit of health and growth in mind, body, and spirit. Today's episode is a nutrition episode. We're talking about Catherine Shanahan's books, Deep Nutrition and The Fat Burn Fix. So, Catherine Shanahan is a doctor and author. She's also done some nutrition consulting for professional sports teams. And I think her books are pretty thorough and pretty comprehensive in terms of painting a picture of nutrition and an optimal diet that's ancestrally consistent. So I hope you enjoy this episode.
So today we are beginning our conversation, the first episode where we dive into specific books and topics. So we'll be talking about works by Dr. Kate Shanahan, particularly Deep Nutrition and her latest book, The Fat Burn Fix. So why don't you tell us maybe why we decided to start at this topic in particular? So maybe at least from your perspective.
Yeah, so I just like her books. These were her Deep Nutrition book was one of the first books I went through on nutrition, and I think it gives a pretty comprehensive picture of nutrition. And so yeah, this was one of the first books I read that talked about I guess like nutrition in terms of like optimizing health and like she gives a good epigenetic perspective on nutrition as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just wasn't exposed to any of this before. Pretty much my knowledge on nutrition was limited to like the food pyramid, things like that. So
Mm-hmm.
this is pretty different. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and I definitely feel that her information is relevant and, in fact, very helpful because as a health coach, one of the biggest challenges that as people start to want to change their health is, how do I stop damaging myself? Because oftentimes we think that if we just eat more this and that, we have more fiber, or eat more supplements, eat more of these good foods, then we can get better. But the reality is, I think we keep hurting ourselves so our body can never heal. And I think in these books, Dr. Shanahan definitely talked about the biggest sources of these health damages that I think most people are suffering from today. So so maybe we can just dive into what she talks about, so I think one of the first things that she pointed out is how the chronic disease is really the modern day challenge. It's not so much the acute injuries, or we have great medicine for that, right? If you get a cut, or if you even need an organ transplant, we can do that. But it's the chronic diseases. So what are those in your perspective? What are these long-term chronic struggles, and what is the difference between maybe the acute and the chronic?
Yeah, so chronic diseases, people also call chronic diseases like modern diseases. They're like diseases of the modern, like westernized world. And these would include things like diabetes, like type 2 diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease. And I guess these, you can contrast them with acute diseases in the sense of acute is just short. So this could be like an injury or an infection, but chronic diseases are like long term and generally considered lifelong diseases or illnesses that somebody will have to just work with and deal with. And so one thing that she points out in her books is that there are a lot of advances in medicine, but the chronic diseases are not being addressed very well, and they're starting to affect people at younger and younger ages. So
Mm-hmm.
diabetes used to be something that was just like adult onset diabetes. Like it was something that affected just older people, but now and like more nowadays, it's affecting younger and younger people, even children. So
Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, most of the clients that come to me for solutions for health coaching is really to address chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes, or just inflammations that would never go away, and you can always see it on their face, on their skin. Right. So and then they take all kinds of medicines, and it just gets worse and worse. Like they have to increase their insulin dosages and so forth. Yeah. So from Dr. Shanahan's perspective, it is the diet. It is a diet. It's not so much just your natural genetics that is triggering these things. Yeah. So what's wrong with the way most people eat nowadays then?
I think the major things, or I guess the major associations or trends you can see is that it's the standard American diet or more westernized diet with a lot of processed foods, or with like a lot of fast food restaurants and stuff like that. Like countries with these, or with a lot of processed foods, or with access to processed foods and fast foods, tend to have a lot more chronic diseases. And that's one thing you can see with a lot of countries, like third world countries. Once the like McDonald's and other fast food restaurants, or access to a lot of processed foods, are introduced to the country, the chronic diseases rise. And so
Yeah, so now you're studying nutrition in school, right? So how would you say the information you're learning from school, in terms of what they teach you, what is healthy diet, how does that line up with how most people eat nowadays still? Because I think we've been seeing the food pyramid, and now it's like the my plate for a long time, right? So would you say what you learn in school that line up pretty well with that, and also does it line up with what people are actually eating?
So I think that pretty much what I'm taught in my in the standard curriculum for dietetics, it does surround just the my plate, and it's pretty consistent with the American dietary guidelines, and like the other, like American Heart Association, like Diabetes Association. All of these organizations will, like, they will promote like the my plate recommendations. It's the standard dietary guidelines, and so it's moved on from the food pyramid. My plate is the new symbol, but yeah, this diet is has like, like it emphasizes fruits and vegetables, and I think that's one of the things that we're taught a lot, to add servings of fruits and vegetables, and in general to decrease processed foods and excess sugar. So I think that that is a good thing, but we're also taught to limit cholesterol. For a while, it was a recommendation to reduce fat, all like total fat intake, pretty severely, and that's something that has changed. So now the like dietary recommendation for fat intake as a percent of your total calories isn't so low, but it's still a recommendation to reduce, or to pretty much really limit saturated fat and trans fat. And so those fat groups are pretty much linked together or associated together, or they're always talked about together. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting how we look at the way we eat, and people are only getting sicker. And I think later on we will look at some of the data that shows that. And even though we have had these guidelines for a long time, 50 years, 50 maybe plus years.
Yeah.
And what I find is also very fascinating that I have a friend who is a long-term missionary to a very it's an indigenous tribe that had a little contact with Western approach to life out in one of those islands in Papua New Guinea area, and they've been there for more than 10 years, and basically they see that on that little island, there's virtually no cancer, no diabetes, right? And then the way they live and eat is they mostly hunt. In fact, they preferred the food that they hunt, eating these animals. And if they have to, because they cannot hunt anything or fish anything, they will try to dig up some roots and eat. But that's like survival food. They prefer not to eat that because it's too much effort to get to a place where those plants grow and then try to eat those things, right? And it takes so much more energy to get that. And then the way they eat is mostly animals, fish, boars that they hunt. But they are very, very healthy. I mean, you look at some of the older people, they look like endurance athletes, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, and that's kind of, that would be a little bit strange, looking at that from, I guess, a standard like dietary perspective, because like one of the things that we learn is that, we learn our macro percentages. So this is how much, like the ratio of carbs to fats to proteins we're supposed to be eating in our diet. And it sounds like they would have a diet that is much higher in protein and fat, but the
exactly.
standard recommendation for carbohydrate intake is 45 to 65% of the calories. So it's about half of your calories recommended, that it comes from carbohydrates.
Yeah, it'll be so much work for them to get that much amount of carbohydrates. I think they will overwork.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So, but then also a lot of people say, well, now it's because of genetics that more people are prone to having diabetes or dementia, or these autoimmune diseases, and so forth. But I think, according to Dr. Shanahan's perspective, that's not necessarily true, right? It's more other environmental factors. So how does that play out?
Yeah. So basically, I think that she describes the epigenetics very well, which is basically the like concept of gene expression. So this is how your environment and your lifestyle, say like your activity level or your nutrient intake or your exposure to different environments or toxins or stressors, how those things can shape how your genes are expressed. Because our genetics aren't particularly, like, they're not set in stone per se, because gene expression allows for, I guess, a little bit of wiggle room. So yeah, so it's not just your genetics, your outcome. It's not just set. Like, there are things that you can do.
Yeah. It seems like definitely there are more people that may be more prone to, let's say, diabetes, because their carbohydrate processing capacity is not as good, or maybe their natural insulin sensitivity is not as good. However, we know that environmental factors in terms of what you eat, whether we have excess amount of carbohydrates or limit amount of carbohydrates, can turn on or off that the genetic expression that results or prevents diabetes, right? I think that's, yeah. So then the question is, what kind of genetic impact that can food have on on us? And I think her explanation includes a lot more. It's not just these chronic diseases, but in fact, these are things that visually we can tell. So what are some of these things that stood out to you as you read the book? It's like, what can food and diet impact? How can it impact the way we are?
Yeah, so she talks about a lot of things in that. One example she gives is how fetal alcohol syndrome can impact a child's, an infant's appearance. Like, you can see different specific traits or patterns in like the face that in these infants. And so that's one pretty clear, pretty strong example of how a mother's diet can impact the child. But she also talks about like facial structure and like
Hmm.
bone density or like and size of like humans and yeah, different things like height. But yeah.
Yeah, personally, for the past more than 10 years, I work in Taiwan in a nonprofit that serves adults with intellectual disabilities. Now, of course, what they suffer or struggle with is not just the more limited intellectual capacity, but you can see that they also suffer a lot of various health challenges, as well as other emotional challenges. And obviously, we know that this particular population is they have much clearer, I guess, damage in terms of their genetics from birth, and this is not so much environmental factor. But even with this population, we realize that better environmental conditions, even things like just having social inclusion, living out in a community versus in an institution, better food, better exercise, you can see their vibrancy change. So even that with much more severe genetic damage, you can still improve their outcome with uh, these external factors, right? So
Mhm.
even the way they look. Now, sometimes maybe people will say that, well, we don't want to overemphasize appearance, right? Because society tends to do that too much already, and that's true. However, I also think that we cannot deny that physical features, are indications of health in some ways, right? So maybe Dr. Shanahan has things that may be more not so PC just to say nowadays, but I think it's still important, right? I mean, I don't know for your generation, uh, how would you try to describe this kind of epigenetic influence to somebody uh, in a way that is not offensive? I don't know how we do that. So maybe we can try.
Yeah, I wouldn't know. Epigenetics is so broad, though. I think that this area of it where she talks about appearance, that's I don't know, that's a little bit harder to describe. But I do think that it is true to an extent. I think you can see the state of somebody's health on the outside, and I think there are like indicators of that. And I think that um, I guess like it is a type of signaling, and maybe it's subconscious, but yeah, like one thing in particular she talks about is symmetry. And so
Mm-hmm.
like in general humans do seem to be more attracted to um more symmetry. And so like maybe somebody's face is more symmetrical, and and it's shown. And she has a section in her book where she writes about like she has a picture of how somebody like how what somebody's brain waves look like, the EEG pattern of the somebody's
Mm-hmm.
brain when they're looking at somebody whose face is very symmetrical versus something that is not so symmetrical. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I think this example is not with somebody's face, but like a symmetrical pattern versus a more messy pattern. And then
Mm-hmm.
she like spans that to describe like symmetry in the human body. But I'm not too. I think epigenetically you can maybe draw a connection to that, but yeah, I think also that is also genetics from like the mother to the child.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we are all naturally attracted, I think, just initially, at least, to people that physically look healthier, right? And that's maybe like
Hmm.
a skin glow, the facial structure, and so forth. But in terms of the population that I work with, even from before, with people with special needs or now adults with health, we see that there's a lot of functional factors that play into this as well. Like if your facial structure, if your jaws are generally wider and your nasal cavity is fuller, you breathe better. And better breathing definitely allows better functioning, not just with your heart and lung, which is obvious, but also your nervous system. A lot of the individuals with anxiety have just bad breathing patterns, and that's oftentimes impacted by the structure of their face and their mouth and teeth and so forth. So I think there's functional differences, and those we know that can be impacted with nutrition as well as some other habits. But nutrition is a huge thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what's the solution? What's the problem? Like I said, my coaching approach is to stop the damage first. So according to her, what's the worst thing? What are the things that we must avoid?
Well, a couple major problems she describes in terms of nutrition or diet is vegetable oil intake and excess sugar. So I don't know if, do you want to talk a little bit about, I guess, the impact excess sugar can have on our health?
Yeah, maybe you can start with the sugar piece. It's no more free Krispy Kreme donuts after you get your vaccine, right? So maybe we should avoid those. Okay, so sugar. Yeah, what's wrong with sugar?
Okay, so I guess sugar in general, excess sugar, and we see this more. Is this kind of a modern thing with, I guess, the availability of a lot of processed foods or like refined sugar products, like cane sugar or corn syrup. That's a pretty major one. It seems that, in the past, in older lifestyle, like hunter-gatherer lifestyles, or even not too long ago, you can talk about just even a couple hundred years ago, we didn't have access to such quantities of sugar. And so it seems that, too much of it all at once, which is pretty common in the standard American diet through things like sodas or, like donuts. A lot of processed foods have a lot of sugar packed into it. Seems like that has a negative impact on, well, specifically a couple major things are our insulin sensitivity, our ability to process these sugars. And this seems to pretty much create inflammation in the system because we're not able to process so much all at once.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the first evil, right? And I think most people realize it, but it's just so addictive. It's so hard to stop. And however, it also has such negative impact because we know that reduction in insulin sensitivity means a lot of other signaling is also weakened. And so things like signals that turn on our immune function, and so forth, that's also reduced because I think insulin is it's a important signal for that as well. So yeah, so it's definitely associated with diabetes and even I think some people call it Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes, right? Or diabetes of the brain, right?
Yeah. And this all seems to go back to that insulin sensitivity, or lack of insulin sensitivity, which is one of the key characteristics of metabolic disease.
Yeah. So how do we shift? I think she talked about the history a little bit, right? How do we shift from a society that did not have that much sugar or carbohydrate into one where that is the majority of our caloric intake?
I don't quite remember about all specifically like the detailed history, but
Yeah.
I know a lot of the the beginning of the production of monocrops, which, corn, where we get corn syrup from, is one of them, started. I don't think any of this, like things that are hurting our health, came from bad intentions, but a lot of it did come from, just wanting to be more efficient in the production of food and feeding people. A lot of it was trying to feed the world, help support third world countries and end hunger. Yeah. So a lot of it was that, and then a lot of it then became, processed food companies, and I think that we just didn't realize for a long time how harmful a lot of these processed foods can be.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think on the flip side of that is that we become much more fat phobic, right? So I know that you prepare some more content to share here. So maybe you talk about now that we move into more carbohydrate, more sugar, and then at the same time we kind of avoided fat because we thought fat is what made us fat. In fact, I did that for a long time. Right? Back when we were still living in the States, I did the P90X program, and then started to cut out all the fats and eat only egg whites and threw away all the egg yolks. I couldn't believe how many egg yolks I threw away back then, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So so how did that come about, and what's the damage in that, I think?
Yeah, so a lot of it, I guess, when we shifted more towards sugar, that was a lot from majorly influenced by a fear of consuming fat. And so okay, so this is a picture from, or a little figure from, her book Deep Nutrition, where she talks about studies or research from Ansel Keys. So Ansel Keys was a physiologist. He was active around doing a lot of research in the 1950s, and he played a major role in shifting, I guess, how Americans thought of fat. And so he really linked saturated fat and cholesterol with cardiovascular disease. And we can still see that in our dietary guidelines now. We're very afraid of saturated fats and cholesterol. And so pretty much she compares a little bit about his data to a more fuller set of data. But basically, he used this you can see on the figure on the little graph on the right, from his 6 countries, that he linked the percent of dietary calories from fat to heart disease and cardiovascular disease related deaths. And so, so she points out here that a fuller set of data actually doesn't support this direct trend or this direct association with fat and cardiovascular disease. And she also points out that margarine wasn't really taken into account, or say trans fats, or the linoleic acids, omega-6 of polyunsaturated fats. So she says that, margarine should be taken into account because this is another factor that could be responsible for this trend, because the countries with the higher deaths and higher fat intake, like the US, England, Canada, and Australia, also had the highest levels of margarine consumption. So maybe this was falsely attributed. And so a little bit more about this idea. This is the diet heart hypothesis. So this is the idea that pretty much that saturated fat and cholesterol is linked to cardiovascular disease and the deaths. And so we can see that this whole idea is that the replacement of saturated fats with vegetable oils in the diet will influence a decrease in cholesterol levels in the blood. And then that is supposed to reduce the coronary heart disease and the deaths. But this is from this figure is actually from a study analyzing the unpublished data from a really large randomized control trial study that Keyes was actually involved in. And so this was unpublished for a while. The whole study wasn't published for a while until after his death. But basically, it shows, which is really ironic. It shows in his own data that there's actually not really connection there. So there is a connection. The solid line from A to B shows that consuming less saturated fats in the diet will reduce serum cholesterol levels, but there isn't a solid connection, and there isn't solid evidence showing that like a reduction in serum cholesterol levels is associated with like less cardiac events. And so you can't really draw the connection from A to C that replacing saturated fat with vegetable oils will reduce cardiovascular disease. So
yeah, that's the there's our body actually requires a lot of cholesterol, and how much it needs I'm not sure we entirely know, I think, even now. But we do know that it is critical for lots of various functions, including the brain, manufacturing of hormones, and so every single cell structure requires cholesterol, right? So
in our cell membranes, But this is more from that study. They basically, in the results section, researchers say that no mortality benefit was there was no mortality benefit for the intervention group, which was the group that replaced saturated fat with vegetable oils, and that there was actually a 22% higher risk of death for each 30 milligram per deciliter reduction in serum cholesterol. So in a sense, there's almost like a negative association, or almost the opposite. There are other studies now that are also indicate that increased dietary cholesterol does not equal increased cardiovascular events. And so, these are just a couple quotes from a couple different studies. The first one is from a meta-analysis. So they're reviewing a lot of different studies, and basically they found that the higher intake of cholesterol was not associated with increased risk of incident cardiovascular disease. And the second one says that epidemiological data do not support a link between dietary cholesterol and cardiovascular disease. So we see that, even though our dietary guidelines really function based off of, I guess, the assumption that dietary cholesterol will create cardiovascular disease, even though those are dietary guidelines, the research doesn't necessarily fully support that. It doesn't go all the way from point A to point B to point C. So maybe it affects our blood cholesterol levels, but our blood cholesterol levels and our intake of saturated fat you can't draw a connection between those things and actual outcomes of cardiovascular disease.
Yeah, wasn't there an adjustment in the egg intake guidelines a few years ago? Because I think I remember we were told before that I think you cannot have more than like 3-4 eggs a week or something, maybe even less. I don't remember. But now I think that just kind of disappeared, right? That quietly disappeared.
Yeah, these things are kind of slowly changing. Like I said, that's another example, like the one I said earlier, how the recommendation for total fat intake was a lot lower before. And I think it's interesting because I think we like to see these dietary guidelines as set in stone. We like to think that we know everything now, but these dietary guidelines are changing, and it's really, we don't know everything yet. So maybe I think it's good to have a little room to question. Like one thing we can look at is say, like, compare our dietary guidelines, the American dietary guidelines, to Canada's dietary guidelines. Canada tends to, or like the like cardiovascular disease like association in Canada, the general dietary guidelines are a little nicer to saturated fats and cholesterol. Like
Mm-hmm.
in some of the statements that they have, they will say that, like, also the other variables in your diet affect these things, affect cardiovascular disease. It's not solely like how much like cholesterol or saturated fat you're intaking. So, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you have the graph for the cholesterol and death mortality. Yeah, I was giving a workshop here at Bosque a couple of days ago on the carnivore diet. So of course, if you're eating only meat and and doing that for a while, people are always asking, well, what about your cholesterol? Isn't your cholesterol going to shoot up? So the graph on the right is I think the study was took place a while back, 2005. On the bottom it says it's 164 country data, and so on the vertical axis is the mortality rate, and the horizontal axis is the level of total cholesterol, right? And if you look at the blue line, that's the most the clear line on top, you see that the lowest mortality rate is it's a relatively high range. If you look at where it intersects, it's about 200 to 240 milligrams per deciliter of total cholesterol. That's the lowest mortality range. And so when I showed this graph, and people were pretty shocked because they were all told to get on some sort of cholesterol lowering drug if the total cholesterol hits 200. Right. So the question is then, if there's a higher mortality rate, lower than, and it's pretty dramatic too, lower than 200, why are we trying so hard to lower our serum cholesterol, right? When our physiological functioning requires a healthy amount of cholesterol. Of course, excessively high, I think, can also be problematic. So it's not that, it's just you don't need to care about your cholesterol, but I think maybe there's more to the cholesterol story than just the numbers.
Yeah, I think this is also a result of like jumping to conclusions based off of observational studies. So in observational studies or epidemiology, we see a lot of correlations or connections. They're not like clinical trials where we basically just like we have multiple groups and then test one group. It's largely observational. So it's hard to account for all the other variables if you're trying to measure a couple things. So I think that, one of the ways we run into trouble is jumping to conclusions based off of just correlations.
Yeah. So if cholesterol is not so much I guess like the biggest villain. I mean, it can be a problem, but that's not the only thing. And then we're told that we gotta reduce these saturated fats and replace it with polyunsaturated fats. Does that help at all? That's the question, right? And I think Dr. Shanahan, in fact, is pointing out that in fact polyunsaturated fats it's what is causing even more of the damage. I mean, maybe even more than carbohydrates and refined sugar. I mean, we know sugar can be a problem, and excess carbohydrate can be a problem. But I think she's pointing out that the wrong kinds of fats may be even more problematic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's pretty crazy because it's the opposite of what we're taught, or the opposite of what the dietary guidelines recommend. That it recommends that we should reduce cholesterol and saturated fat, and increase vegetable oil or polyunsaturated fat intake.
Yeah, so maybe we can dive into that a little bit. And so I will share about the next few slides for a while. And now this is not, our own creation. We did not create these slides. This is taken from Dr. Chris Knob's presentation. And he did much more extensive study in terms of the impact of omega-6 linoleic acids. And there was a really good podcast conversation between Dr. Paul Saladino and Dr. Chris Knob. And so this is from that. And from the first slide, we see that first of all, because of the increase in the consumption of these seed oils, right, of linoleic acid, the buildup of these kind of oil in our adipose tissues and our fat tissues also increased dramatically. Right, so we know that this kind of oil became popular even before the 50s, but I think it really took off partly because of the war and the aftermath of the war. Now you have all the capacity to produce all these corn and soy. So what do? So you make more of these oils, and so the buildup of these fatty acids in our tissue, in our fat stores, increased in 59 from 9.1% to 21.5%. And the latest figure that I read is something closer to 30% now. So 30% of our fat tissues, from whatever fat you accumulate in your body, is composed of these these omega-6 linoleic acids, and this we can see a high correlation with the modern diseases. So if you look at the next slide, so obviously this is just that. Okay, so the increase is correlated with vegetable fat or oil consumption, right? Before 1900s is very, very low, and in the 20th century, and especially the past 7 years or so, it increased dramatically. And in the next slide, we'll see a correlation between that and obesity. Right, so we know sugar is correlated with obesity, but I think we didn't realize that maybe even before the problem of carbohydrate is the problem of the seed oil, because we also see a correlation, because after we realize that carbohydrate may be a problem, or especially sugar may be a problem, people start to cut back on sugar. So our sugar consumption has stabilized. And in fact, many people are avoiding sugar, but the obesity rate is still increasing. Right. So in this graph, we see sugar consumption, in fact, reduce, but obesity hasn't. And that's what's really interesting in Asian countries, because you lived in Taiwan for many years, and Taiwanese people are always saying, "Oh, that's too sweet. That's so sugary." We should. Yeah. So people are avoiding sugar, but these cheap vegetable oil is everywhere in our food. Where you go to restaurants, people eat out a lot because it's so convenient here in Taiwan. Every street corner has tons of little eateries, and you can not just like Uber Eats and Food Panda. Basically, you can, and 7-Eleven, right? You just walk downstairs from your apartment, there's food, and it's all cooked in these oil. And so the prevalence of this kind of oil is driving up not just obesity, but diabetes. These rates has been increasing dramatically, even though Taiwan has one of the best healthcare systems in the world. But these kind of problems are only increasing. And so, and Taiwanese people are not particularly crazy about sugar. They always avoiding sugar. So what's the driver, right? That's the question. And it seems like these seed oil is the culprit here. Yeah. So I don't know what the next slide shows. So next slide. This is Dr. K. Shanahan's. I think it's also in the book, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we see that various fats like butter and lard is relatively stable. It's not we don't see a increase. In fact, we see a decrease because people are avoiding saturated fat, and even carbohydrate amount. I mean, there's a bump, but still is stabilized. But seed oils is just shooting up, and the chronic disease rates are shooting up. So there's, in fact, a much higher correlation. Of course, these are observational studies. You can only see correlation. You cannot see causation. But at the same time, without correlation, you cannot determine causation also, right? So obviously carbohydrate and diabetes, there's some correlation. It's pretty strong correlation. But then there are also times where the correlation isn't quite there because carbohydrate and sugar consumption has been dropping. Yeah, but the chronic diseases are still going up. But that correlates better with the seed oil. Yeah, so it's pretty crazy when I tell people that. And usually for health coaching, this is the hardest thing to eliminate. But it's also the most crucial because a convenience factor it's in everything we eat. If you eat out, if you don't cook yourself, basically every restaurant, that's the kind of oil they use is cheap. Every packaged food and processed food, that's the kind of oil they use is because it's cheap.
Yeah. Yeah, so here we can see a little bit about, so omega-6s are linoleic acids. They're the polyunsaturated fats. They're the vegetable oils in all of these processed foods and everybody's cooking oils. And you can see that chemically, the impact that they have in the body is an inflammatory effect, cause inflammation, vasoconstriction, platelet aggregation. And so, yeah, we can generally see that they're pretty inflammatory. And so this is just an example directly of the impact that they're having inside the body. And this is a picture from her book in Deep Nutrition. And yeah, she's showing that like these damaged fats, or that these fats that are these omega-6s, these vegetable oils, they're very prone to oxidation. And so even like trans fats are also like very, very, very harmful. And so these fatty acids, when they're damaged, because they're very easily prone to oxidation and damage, they can pretty much just take up the space and take up the function of the like enzymes, or they can block different processes in our body. So they can really limit things like weight loss, or like our ability to burn fat or build muscle. Like no matter how hard you're trying to calorie restrict or exercise. And so it seems that these do have a pretty large impact on our health, and kind of shows that, a calorie is not a calorie. There are different kinds of foods. And this is her whole idea about epigenetics, that food it's information. It's signaling your body. It's signaling in your body. It impacts your gene expression, how your body functions. It's not just a matter of a fat is however many calories, and a carbohydrate is this many calories. So
yeah, what I'm finding is that all these negative impacts can also accumulate and amplify their impact, their effect on health. The earlier graph, we see that a lot of people nowadays have really high percentage of their stored body fat as omega-6s. Now, they're polyunsaturated because they have more of these double bonds where oxygen molecules can attach to and oxidize, right? And what I'm finding is that these people also tend to not use oxygen very efficiently. You can tell from the way they breathe. Their breathing rate is high, so they are not their CO2 tolerance is low, and CO2 is crucial in mobilizing the utilization of oxygen. So what happens is they overbreathe. They have more oxygen molecules in their body, and that tend to also react to these fatty acids. So what we end up doing is carrying all these oxidized fats in our body. And people talk about, well, when you have excess body fat, basically you are storing inflammation in these fat molecules, right? And that's what we're seeing. And that's what I'm seeing. So, and I remember this person who has been on a pretty strict, very restrictive in terms of the type of fat that she's been consuming. She's only cooking at home. Once in a while, her son wants a cheat day, but she's been limiting herself from these cheat days when they go out to eat. So she's been eating clean, and you can see her skin just change. And just since January, and right now it's March, she still has a lot of excess body fat, and which she's working on. But then you can start to see the change already. The skin quality, the skin tone, her energy level, and then also she also knows when she eats these PUFAs, when she eats out, she definitely can feel the negative impact. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, even me too. Like I noticed that when I do eat out too much, or if I eat fried foods in particular, which fried foods are always fried in vegetable oils and in PUFAs and polyunsaturated fatty acids. And I noticed that I always get acne after I eat these foods. So yeah, because acne is, or like redness of the skin, it is a sign of inflammation. Yeah.
Yeah, so PUFA, inflammatory, and it's also very difficult to utilize. I don't know if we prepared this slide, but I don't think I did. I don't think we did. But I remember Dr. Shanahan also has a slide. I think it's in the Fat Burn Fix book, where she look at the utilization or the efficiency of various fats and how much your body can access the stored calories. And saturated fats is basically you have good access. It's a very high level. And I think monounsaturated fat is also very high. So fats from things like olive oil, butter, these are, olive oil has more monounsaturated and butter has more saturated. Your body can use them very efficiently. But these PUFAs, I think the utilization rate is only maybe about half. So now you have all these calories that you have no access to. So maybe you use half of it, but then the other half has to go somewhere and they get stored. So it's much easier to store and accumulate body fat when we are over consuming PUFAs, and then they stay in us and they get oxidized and they turn inflammatory, and then now our whole body is inflammatory. And so what I'm finding is that people that have been following ketogenic diet that I've been coaching, they initially lose a lot of weight, but mainly from reducing inflammation, because then their body is getting rid of the excess water accumulation. And it's not necessarily true fat weight yet, but still that is very good because you're reducing your inflammation. And then they start to be able to burn off those stored body fat as well. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Do you think you could, like, I guess, name some of the what these vegetable oils are? Some of the most common vegetable oils, these PUFAs.
What all the restaurants use in Taiwan, and I think probably in America as well, soybean oil. U.S. is probably the largest soybean producer in the world, right? And in Taiwan, people love soy, soy everything. So that's a huge source. Soybean oil, the vegetable oils, even things like other type of seed oils. Corn, I think, is another huge one. Soy, corn. maybe in the U.S. it's lesser extent peanut oil, but Taiwan peanut oil is pretty common. Um, Sunflower seed oil, even like grape seed oil, or
Mm-hmm.
rapeseed oil, which is canola. I think it's
Yeah,
canola oil.
canola.
Yeah. So these are all very common ones, and sometimes it's a mixture of that. And a lot of the supposedly olive oil you buy, it's a blend of these things with a little
Mm-hmm.
bit of olive oil, so that's not necessarily good either. So these are everywhere in our diet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what about some of the fats that you would use to cook with?
Yeah, so I think that's maybe what we can dive into then, because then Dr. Shanahan talks about then what if we are taking these things out, what do we eat instead, right? Yeah, so
Yeah.
fats wise, basically, I would pick saturated fat and monounsaturated fat. So saturated fats are mostly animal fats. I cook with butter, ghee mostly. These are the two top ones. In Taiwan, it's easy to get also get lard because Taiwan raised a lot of pigs, and then they have this method of steaming the fat and extracting the lard that way, so it's less high heat.
Mm-hmm.
Even though lard is, we think lard is a lot of saturated, but in fact, lard has a lot of monounsaturated fatty acids in there.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can get duck fat, goose fat, those are all good. Tallow, or you can just get cook your bacon, or even just cook your bacon and keep the fat, or
Mm-hmm.
cook your fatty pieces of beef and keep the fat. We oftentimes use that. Coconut oil is another one that is very high in saturated fats. So generally, you are able to cook with these. Now, there are other fats that we can consume, but maybe not necessarily cook with. So that's more the olive oil. I mean, you can lower temperature is probably still okay, but oftentimes we just consume it directly over as a dressing or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Avocado oil it's also pretty good. You can cook. It does allow for higher heat, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it has a higher smoke point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so basically try to stay with the animals and or stay with the oils that's extracted from the fruits, not from the
Mm-hmm.
seeds of the plant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. So it seems like this diet would be a diet higher in meats or animal meats, where you would be able to use and consume the like animal protein and the animal fat that comes with it. Now, what about carbohydrates though? How I guess like what carbohydrates do you have in your diet? What are the things that you might avoid and some things that you would allow?
Yeah, when I'm coaching, I always tell people basically anything that is highly processed, you avoid. Then that will
Mm,
allow us to avoid the highly processed carbohydrates and fats.
yeah.
But specifically to the carb, what we don't want is the simple sugars or very broken down type of carbohydrates. Like even we
Mhm,
think, okay, flour, maybe even like whole wheat flour, but that's still very broken down because it's milled, it's ground
mhm,
up, and it's your body can take that in really quickly. It's not a whole lot different from sugar. So anything that is quickly absorbed. But in terms of how fast these things absorb, I think liquid form of carbohydrate is definitely the worst because basically the instant you drink it, your blood sugar will spike. So sugary
yeah,
drinks, soda, in Taiwan will be all these tea drinks, and that is
yeah,
everywhere. These tea vendors. Right. So, like milk tea is probably the worst because you got a combination of these quick sugars and these. Okay, first of all, milk tea people don't use milk. They use creamer, which is a vegetable oil based.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you use to create that creamy taste. Milk itself is actually not creamy enough. So
Mm-hmm.
I know because I used to run food service with the disability services as part of the shelter workshop, and we used to sell milk tea, and that's before I knew any of this stuff. So that's why we use creamer, and tasted good, but people love it, but it's horrible for your health. Yeah. So simple sugars, liquid sugars definitely, and then simple carbohydrates such as things made with milled flours, any kind of corn flour, wheat flour, so bread, pasta type of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I guess instead of those things, like, do you still have carbs in your diet though? Like when you do consume carbs, what are your choice?
Yeah, personally, is very, very limited. Since I've been on more of a carnivore-ish diet, I haven't eaten much. But once in a while, if I'm doing high intensity training, I might add some honey, add some fruit with the peels taken off, the most toxic parts of the plant taken off. I've been for a lot of people, things like sweet potatoes, squash, pumpkins are probably pretty good. But for me, I avoid sweet potatoes because of oxalates, because I have kidney stone issues. If I'm not careful, I will get kidney stones. So for a lot of people, these kind of more starchy vegetables are good, or roots are okay. But for me, if I really need carbohydrate, I add some fruit and honey. And I do once in a while eat bread, but it's sourdough bread because the fermentation process does something to it. And that's one of, I think, Dr. Shanahan's principles, right? Eating the fermented food. But we'll dive into that later. I think maybe you can talk about what her recommendations are later. Yes, but in terms of starches, if I do use it, it's generally honey, fruits, and maybe some or fermented vegetables, and maybe some sourdough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's pretty interesting. I think there is a little bit of like people generally don't like agree too much on, I guess, like carbohydrates. A lot of people are on the like no carb camp or in the no carb camp, and then some people are like, it's totally fine. And I think that a more traditional view, I think, like brown rice and whole wheat bread, for example, like whole grain products are considered complex carbohydrates. And I think that's why, Kate Shanahan, I think she's the one who distinguishes it by like describing these carbohydrates to consume as slow carbs rather than like complex carbs, because wheat, like whole wheat bread and products are still considered like complex carbohydrates. And so, yeah, do you have any insight on that in terms of, I guess, the glycemic response, or like what kind of immediate impact that those foods have on the system and blood sugars versus, say, sourdough?
Yeah. So, because I do run a bakery, and we mainly make sourdough based or low carb, ketogenic diet friendly breads, or some gluten free breads for that particular population. So I tested. I'm like right now I'm wearing a CGM. So I read it with this, and you can see what my blood glucose 79. It's like it's barely in the black. Like it's been red for this whole morning. It's been warning me, saying, "Oh, your blood sugar is too low." But anyways, So I wear that, and I even did a video trying out all kinds of different breads and particularly breads. So definitely, I know that in terms of glycemic response, any kind of conventional bread is terrible. It will just shoot up, and oftentimes even stay for a long time. Uh, I'm not diabetic or anything, but so it still comes down pretty quickly. But compared to sourdough's level is barely in any bump, and it just kind of just comes down to in the 80s range, 70, 80s range. So there's a huge difference, and that's true for a lot of people as well. So I think part of it is because our blood glucose response obviously react to carbohydrate, but it also responds to other stressors. So if there are other toxins in these plants, our body can also react to that. We know that sourdough process breaks down a lot of the gluten and the phytates, which can be for many people considered toxic to their system. They're not able to break it down. So you would have some sort of even higher blood sugar response to that as well. But also it tastes sour, so a lot of the sugar is already also broken down. The simple sugar in the bread is broken down already, so you have more level response. Sourdough is about the only bread that I eat because that's the one with the most stable blood glucose response. I tried like the 7-Eleven bagels, these Taiwanese pastry breads, the pineapple breads or whatever, the red bean breads. Yeah. Even with a smaller amount, lesser amount, I get a bigger sugar spike.
Yeah. So. Yeah, I guess just one more thing to show that not all the calories are created equal.
Yeah. So, according to Dr. Shanahan, then how do we pick what we eat and why? So maybe you can share with us her recommendations.
Yeah. So she has what she calls the 4 pillars of health. So the first one is bone-in meat. So eating meat or cooking meat, roasting meat on the bone. And then she has the second pillar, organs, third pillar, fermented or sprouted foods, and then the fourth pillar, fresh foods. So a little bit about the bone-in meat. I think that a lot of this and a lot of all the other pillars of health, they really, I guess, capture just eating natural foods and whole foods. And so a little bit about what she talks about in the render section on eating meat on the bone is that, getting all the extra nutrients that are in the bones. And so I guess one of the ways that we do this is we like to drink bone broth, or we like to make bone broth at home. Sometimes we'll do, like, if we roast chicken, then we'll just save the bones and then like make a bone broth afterwards, or we'll get like pork bones or beef bones and then just boil that, and then just boil that for hours and then just make a bone broth at home.
I always go to the market and pick up bones, so it's easy here in Taiwan. Just walk out to the local market and just grab these huge pork bones, and they'll cut it up for you and just throw it in a pot with some chicken carcass. You can also buy chicken carcass in the market here. So
that's very nice. Here it's a bit harder to find. They sell like prepackaged like cartons of bone broth, but I don't know. I actually haven't tried any of those before. I always just make it at home, so I'll have to go like to Asian market or more like a smaller market, not standard grocery stores here, to be able to find bones or just like different parts of the animal, like the organs. Those can be a bit harder to find here too. But her second pillar is organs, eating organ meats, and one of the reasons why is that organ meats are almost like superfoods, you know? They're like there's
Mm-hmm.
so much hype surrounding superfoods like goji berries or like different plants. But actually we're finding that, you know, organ meats are almost like a hidden underrepresented superfood. They're very, very
Mm-hmm.
nutrient dense. So here's a comparison of how like the micronutrient breakdown of 100 grams of beef liver versus red meat, carrots, and apple. And
Yeah,
so,
that's huge.
yeah, yeah, you can see that you're actually getting a lot of nutrients, micronutrients in just a 100-gram serving of beef liver. And so, yeah, it's pretty crazy, but I think that it is difficult for people to eat, and for me, even like I think I'm starting to get used to the taste of liver. I'm just starting, and it's been like at least a couple years. It's definitely an acquired taste, but yeah, it's very good, very nutrient dense.
Yeah, especially in the B vitamin family, the B, you know, you got listed B6, B12, but also folic acid, biotin. These are all riboflavin. These are all B
Hmm.
complex or
They're B
B family
vitamins.
of vitamins. Yeah, yeah. So this is what most people are lacking. Really lacking,
Hmm.
and it's just hard to get enough bioavailable forms of these. Even supplementation, you know, we end up peeing out most of it. It's all like, you know, you take B vitamin complex and it just your pee turns yellow, right? So it's just you're not
Yeah.
really absorbed. But you don't get that when you eat liver. So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So that's another, I guess, another principle in eating foods in nature's package. So like you can look at this in terms of like eating beef liver or like eating a meat product. It will have a little bit of fat in it because, you know, the fat and protein usually come together in animal products, and that really helps with the fat soluble vitamins. And so, you know, naturally, some vitamins are water soluble, some vitamins are fat soluble. And so,
Mm.
um, eating this in, I guess, the natural package with fat in it helps for absorption or the bioavailability of these micronutrients. So can be pretty beneficial just to eat it from, I guess, the natural package in meat or organ meats. So yeah.
Yeah, and even vitamin A, right? We always, you know, for our let's say eye health or something like that, we want
Hmm.
to get vitamin A, and
Hmm.
yeah, just beef has just tremendous amount of bioavailable vitamin A. Um,
Hmm. Yeah.
yeah, organ meats and heart and so forth as well.
Hmm.
I think heart is
Yeah.
very rich in coenzyme Q10.
Hmm.
Right, yeah, eating heart for your heart health, right? Because
Yeah.
oftentimes people take CoQ10 supplements for their heart. Well, you can eat a heart and also get very much bioavailable ones. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. And so I guess moving on to the third pillar, um, which is fermented foods. Um, Yeah, so this can really help like your gut bacteria or like digestion, but also just the like absorption or just digestion of these foods because sometimes like if your gut is not in an optimal state, these foods can be kind of difficult to break down or digest, and so
mm,
you can kind of almost think of it as like these if you're eating fermented foods there it's already processed a little bit in the bacteria that you know fermented the foods. And so fermented foods could include like kimchi or like yogurt, like kombucha or even
mm.
sourdough. These are all fermented foods. But
So, what do you do to get these?
well, I like to eat kimchi. I like kimchi. Yeah, and like yogurt. I eat yogurt too. And if I go to Asian market, then like sometimes I'll get like natto too, like the
Mm,
soy, like a soybean, like a fermented soybean thing. Or you could also get it through sauerkraut or
mm.
yeah. So. And
And they're not too difficult
so
to make. Yeah.
yeah, they're not too difficult to make either. Um, but yeah, so do you want to talk about if any of the foods that you've made, any of the fermented foods?
Yeah. If I'm more on task, I would usually try to make some sort of yogurt.
Yeah.
It's very easy to get kimchi here because there are a lot of authentic
Hmm.
kimchi that people ferment. I just call them and then we get it delivered, free
Hmm.
delivery, and you'll get these jars. So that's pretty easy. Sourdough we make
Hmm.
downstairs in my bakery. So uh,
Yeah.
natto, it's also easy to get in the Japanese supermarkets here. I think in Asia in general, it's pretty easy to get these authentic,
Hmm.
real fermented foods, not just people adding the flavor into these
Yeah.
foods. So I guess that's the one caveat. Just be careful what you get, and it's in fact fermented.
Yeah. I think it can be a bit tougher here in the US. I think yogurt is a pretty solid choice. You can make yogurt at home too. Most people, I don't think they do, but you can buy a yogurt machine or yogurt maker that keeps the mixture at a consistent temperature and just make it yourself. You can read up on it. It's not too difficult. But yeah, you can do that. Kombucha is pretty easy to make too. I guess the only thing I would look out for is the sugar. Like
Mm.
there can be a lot of sugar in it. So just watch out for that when you make it. Like you can get a SCOBY, like the mother or the base of the kombucha pretty easily. Like I think I got mine just off of Amazon. Like I think I just
Mm.
ordered it on Amazon and in a package. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, so you could make kombucha. But yeah, I would just watch out for things like I guess like chemically made fermented food. So they're not really fermented, but it's like artificial, like just to make it sour, that or just to
Mm.
the taste there. A lot of like sauerkraut isn't actually fermented. It's just like
Mm.
flavored. And so yeah, like a sauerkraut would be a good source, but just make sure it's actually fermented. Um,
Yeah,
but
sourdough too. There are a lot of fake sourdoughs.
yeah, yeah. But yeah, so I guess that's fermentation. And do you want to talk a little bit about sprouting and like the different like things that you've used to sprout or to bake bread with?
Yeah, it's much more difficult to do this sprouted grains here in Taiwan. I know that, in the U.S., there's that Ezekiel bread, which is
Yeah.
pretty popular, and so they do try to sprout those. I sprouted some buckwheat, or just some wheat, and so the wheat kernels. But then it's difficult to melt those and make them into flour. So generally, I don't do a whole lot of that in the bread. But we would sometimes try to sprout some seeds, red beans, green beans, and you can cook red bean soup or green bean soup if you really want to have some beans and legumes and so forth. You can
Hmm.
try to sprout those before you cook them and still pressure cook them for a long time to break down the lectins inside. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, so these plant toxins, sprouting can reduce some of that. Soaking can reduce some of that. So usually we'll try to soak for at least 6 to 8 hours and
Hmm.
dump the water to get rid of some of the saponins. Um,
Hmm.
Yeah, even things like quinoa. Quinoa is actually very high in saponin. So
Hmm.
you want to definitely soak that and sprout that if possible.
Hmm. Yeah, and so I guess you could say that the like sprouting foods or fermenting foods is a natural way of like processing them a little bit and almost like neutralizing these like compounds and these like chemical defenses that these plants and the seeds have just innately built in. It kind of neutralizes them or can like process them a little more. So like these vegetables or legumes can be more easily digested.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, because that's why we would try to choose some fermented and sprouted foods. And her fourth pillar is fresh food. And so I think that this largely encompasses like eating local foods and eating seasonally. And so this would be like trying to source from, I guess, just like source local foods and eat the foods that are in season at, at any given time. And could you talk about a little bit about like why we would do that?
Yeah, genetically, that also makes sense because, we heard about the concept of circadian rhythm, right, on the daily cycle. But our body also has these longer seasonal rhythms. So if we are eating fruits and vegetables that are in season, our body tend to process and tolerate that. And also it will naturally have these feast and famine cycles. And these natural cycles as well as stressors allow our, especially the metabolic function to stay flexible. So sometimes, during summer, you can consume more fruits because that's where naturally, especially the local fruits, because they'll be more ripe, and they generally will be sweeter. And so your body can learn how to use carbohydrates efficiently. But in winter months, you naturally reduce the amount of these carbohydrates, and so your body kind of go into a slight carbohydrate deficit or a bit of a famine mode, and learn how to use store fats, metabolize fats more efficiently. So that natural cycle will allow our body to remain metabolically flexible, which is what we want. So I'm not always staying ketosis, so you can have these cycles. So that's why eating local and seasonal is important. Also, genetically, I think where you are from, you're probably more suitable in terms of eating the plants that are in that region. Though that may be a less, I guess, a smaller impact or less of a factor since we're so genetically diverse nowadays, makes because we travel, But in terms of the seasonal cycles, as to food and carb availability, I think that does make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So she definitely has a lot of good stuff, and so I think if you're listening to this, I would definitely encourage you to consider how do we stop the damage first. I mean, really avoid these PUFAs, excess amount of PUFAs, and cut down on these refined carbohydrates for sure. So our body has a chance to get rid of these damaged cells, these excess stored PUFAs in our fats, reduce the inflammation so our body can begin the process of healing, and then implement these, 4 pillars of health: eating meat on the bones, eating organ meats, basically nose to tail, right? Eating fermented and sprouted foods, and eating local and seasonal. I think these things, after we stop the damage, then these practices can help our body restore and recover. And so that's definitely our personal experience as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I think like one of the first things I tried, like it was definitely like not just overnight. All of these changes did not happen overnight. I think the first thing I changed, I think it was just limiting sugar. So it wasn't even all sugar, like all carbohydrates. It was only limiting or getting rid of excess sugar or added sugars. So I stopped drinking like a lot of like tea drinks or sodas or a lot of processed foods too. I just said any food with added sugar, I wouldn't eat. And so that innately just limited me to a lot of fresh foods or foods that I cooked myself or like home cooked foods and or just fruit. So that still has sugar, but it's very difficult to get the like equivalent amount of sugar in a can of Coke from just whole oranges, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
you'd have to eat a ton of oranges and you'd be
Yeah.
pretty full if you wanted to get the same amount of sugar. And so just that simple change, like I think that was the first thing I did. And another step I took, like it was pretty natural after limiting added sugars, was just getting rid of all processed foods. So I stopped eating packaged foods and like a lot of like chips or like packaged like breads and foods that I would just like buy quickly, like from the store, or like crackers and anything like that. Like I just limited processed foods, and then instead of that, I had to eat more whole foods. And so yeah, I think those are a couple pretty simple, pretty easy steps. But yeah.
Yeah. Good. And so hopefully this has been an informative episode on these two books, and I'll encourage you to get out and buy a copy or something and just read up. I think there's definitely a lot more details that we couldn't cover. So these are some of our own takeaways, and I hope you enjoyed this episode.
Yeah. So thanks for listening.